Moves inside.
Hello, partner?
Population, especially in the United States, where there's large disparity in the amount of people who receive this diagnosis, like for women and for minority groups. Because of this high rate of misdiagnosis for these groups, it is due to inherent biases through like inappropriate heuristics that clinicians may or may not use for diagnosis. As we were talking about earlier, women experience atypical symptoms for heart attack compared to men, because doctors may or may not be aware of these atypical symptoms and may not be able to draw connections from those symptoms to heart attacks. They might not be able to provide those patients with the appropriate measures to get to that diagnosis. And then if you combine that with human error, clinicians, they are human, they do great things when they are human, so they do make mistakes, especially when they're working night shifts or they're stressed out, working long hours, that they are subject to, it is possible that they make misinterpretations of data. And this can really have a big effect through misdiagnosis of patients.
So this is exactly what Cardio Cloud does. We are here to, Cardio Cloud has an AI-powered cloud-based platform that is meant to solve this misdiagnosis solution. With its capabilities, it's able to process EKGs, X-rays, echocardiograms, and echocardiograms, either all separately or all together to make one unified diagnosis. This is incredibly powerful and potent. As you can see with the Cardio Cloud platform, you're able to look at each of these different data modalities. And the way I like to think about it is if you look at a patient and a patient comes into the hospital and they get admitted, right? They're already having so many different forms of data being collected on them. But the second they sit down in the waiting room to get admitted, they're filling out a bunch of forms where they talk about their medical history, their symptoms, or their family history. And the second they get admitted, they can actually see a doctor, get a physical done, get a diagnostic test ordered. And all of these things are all going into their patient portal. And all of this data is just waiting to be analyzed, ready to be analyzed by an AI model that can move very quickly. Wow, it would take a doctor or a regular clinician days to about a week to look through all this data and actually come up with a proper diagnosis. Our AI model can actually do literally seconds. It also has enhanced accuracy. It's able to look at all of the data instead of just a small subset. That makes it more important.
So now just to kind of go over our data ecosystem. We use a variety of data sources that enable our platform to give a full picture of the patient's condition. So starting off with the demographic data, that's like the racial data, their nationality, really anything about their environment that may or may not impact what sort of condition they're predisposed to getting. Next, there's the clinical notes, any notes that any clinician or healthcare provider may or may not have on a patient. They can kind of reveal any past symptoms that the patient has had, any past diagnoses that clinicians have given them, or even like other past medical history or even family history that can definitely go along and provide proper diagnosis. Then there's EKGs or electrocardiograms. That's important for understanding the electrical activity that's required for the conduction system of the heart to communicate with the contraction mechanism of the heart. And then there's X-ray imaging, especially for the chest. Understanding the structure of the heart is vital to getting a proper diagnosis. And then there's echocardiograms. That's really vital for understanding the functionality of every patient's heart and seeing how blood flows through and how that may or may not relate to different diagnoses and conditions. So then we take all of this down and we isolate it and process it all separately so that we can kind of extract the main principal points and main takeaways from each of these sets of data. And then we combine all those separate data points and we can combine them with a fusion model and a transformer in order to get a unified output, which will give you like a conclusion that it really gives you a unified conclusion or diagnosis that kind of takes into account the entire picture of the patient.
So to go a little bit more in depth about how our model works, as just described earlier, we have a series of encoders. We have specified architecture encoders for each of our data modalities. And the two general broad types of encoders we're using are convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, and large language models, or LLMs. CNNs are essentially a large, complex architecture made up of receptrons. Receptrons are a very basic form of model that's supposed to mimic a neuron in the brain. It takes an input through a weighted matrix using an output. And these CNNs are enormous, very intricate networks of millions or thousands of millions of these
Sort of condition and predisposed to getting. Next, there's the clinical notes. Any notes that any clinician or health provider may or may not have on a patient can kind of reveal any past symptoms that the patient has had, any past diagnoses that clinicians have given them, or anything like other past medical history or even family history that can definitely go along and provide proper diagnosis. Then there's EKGs or electrocardiograms. That's important for understanding the electrical activity that's required for the conduction system of the heart to communicate with the contraction mechanism of the heart. And then there's X-ray imaging, especially for the chest. Understanding the structure of the heart is vital to giving a proper diagnosis. And then there's echocardiograms. That's really vital for understanding the functionality of every patient's heart and seeing how blood flows through and how that may or may not relate to different diagnoses and conditions. So then we take all of this data and we isolate it and process it all separately so that we can kind of extract the main principal points and main takeaways from each of these sets of data. And then we combine all those separate data points and we can combine them in a fusion model or a transform model in order to get a unified output, which will give you like a conclusion that it really gives you a unified conclusion or diagnosis that kind of takes into account the entire patient of the patient.
So to go a little bit more in depth about how our model works, as just described earlier, we have a series of encoders, specified architecture encoders for each of our data modalities. And the two general broad types of encoders we're using are convolutional neural networks for CNNs and large language models for LLM. CNNs are essentially a large, complex architecture made up of receptrons. Receptrons are a very basic form of model that's supposed to mimic a neuron in the brain. It takes an input through a weighted matrix using an output. And these CNNs are enormous, very intricate networks of millions or thousands of millions of these receptor models, giving you a very complex architecture. And this architecture also makes it very suitable for analyzing imaging and mathematical data, and complete mathematical content. This makes it ideal for looking at echocardiograms, X-ray, LLMs, as the name kind of implies, large language model, is very good at analyzing language and text. So some of the most better known LLMs are like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. These are all very good at taking large amounts of textual data and analyzing it. But when you take these LLMs and you train them, put them in the context of the clinical world or medical realm, it's able to be able to process a lot of text a lot better. So when you put all of our data modalities into these specified encoders, it's able to isolate the very important properties, the specific properties that are essential for diagnosis. And then you kind of combine them all in the transform model. And this essentially is able to look at the relationships across the different modalities. So that way, this entire diagnostic process is able to find relationships within each modality and across the different, giving a very comprehensive look at the information.
So with our platform, with the cardio platform, we're really hoping to address three main goals. First off, improving the speed of the diagnostic process. As we've already said multiple times, it can sometimes take days or even up to a week for more complex cardiovascular cases. And AI really has the potential to reduce that down to seconds. And that gives the patient and the clinician more time to make the appropriate clinical decisions and have appropriate intervention for the patient. Then there's also enhanced accuracy. You think about AI, about being able to draw vague connections, even vital connections in between the many different data sources, we'd be able to get a much more accurate model as opposed to the 6% misdiagnosis rate that we've already seen in the emergency department that we already talked about with cardiovascular disease. Improving that accuracy could really change many people's lives. And then there's the early detection feature. We believe that's kind of combining both the improved speed and the enhanced accuracy. Early detection, if you can detect the presence of a disease in a patient at a much earlier point in time, a much earlier point in the progression of the disease, you can be able to address that disease at a much earlier point in time and prevent it from getting out of hand for the patient and causing any adverse side and it gives the patient and the clinician more time to take the appropriate measures to give that patient both a better quality of life